Patient files of Dr. William Wickman, director of Hillbrook Insane Asylum. Patient 502, first name Jim, presumably, surname unknown, aka the horrific Piranha Boy, or simply Piranha Boy. Not much I can do about that unflattering nickname. The patient was known for it prior to admission to Hillbrook. And considering the uncertainty of patient 502's actual name, Piranha Boy is how he's primarily known. Patient 502 hasn't shown any signs of improvement and continues to viciously attack anyone who so much as enters his cell. 5 orderlies and 2 nurses have been injured so far, while 1 orderly even had to pay with his life. Chalk that up as yet another murder on patient 502's criminal record. As a result of the patient's incredibly violent nature, he is kept sedated for most of the time. I simply see no version of the future where 502 is ever released from this facility. Poor fellow, his is such a sad story too. The best way to tell you the story of the horrific Piranha Boy would be to do it through the eyes of a young girl named Evelyn, nicknamed Eve by her friends. That is, if she had had any friends. She was the introverted type, incredibly shy and socially awkward, or perhaps this was a result of her isolation. Nevertheless, Evelyn spent most of her time at home in her room, reading books, as opposed to going out and playing with the other children. Evelyn cherished her books, and the characters featured in those stories were her only friends. Alice, Dorothy Gale, Harry Potter, and so on. A few of the books she owned, while the majority she kept borrowing and re-borrowing from the local library. In her mind, she would disappear into the worlds of these books and play with her friends, fleeing drab reality. Evelyn's parents weren't cruel by any means, but they weren't especially loving either. In fact, they weren't much of anything. Distant and neglectful, they mostly worried about their own problems as opposed to their daughters. She had learned not to mind though, and usually kept to herself, only socializing with her parents during dinner. One day a traveling carnival came to their town and set up shop just a couple of blocks away from Evelyn's house. She walked past it every time going to and from school. And each time felt the urge to enter. Something about the carnival seemed intriguing. Garish colors, flashing lights, loud and strange music, the smell of candy. It seemed like something out of her books, a certified wonderland. During one lunch break at school, Evelyn finally decided to enter the wonderland. She left school midway through the day, something she did often anyway, and which not many seemed to notice or care about. The only time Evelyn's classmates paid her any attention was when mocking her after all. The carnival was a remarkable place, unlike anything she had seen in real life before. Large tents covered in stripes in all the colors of the rainbow. Big scary rides that spun around and went high up into the air. Wacky clowns handing out colorful balloons shaped like animals. BB gun shooting ranges where your prizes were oversized teddy bears. Cotton candy stands that smell like sugar. Evelyn didn't try anything and simply wandered around the place, taking it all in. Then something caught her attention. In a sort of morbid sense. She had stumbled upon the freak show section of the carnival. A big tent with a large sign that read, "Grotesque Wonders of the World," in big stylized letters. Evelyn paid a small fee and entered. Inside she was made witness to Bonesy, the supposedly skinniest man in the world. An incredibly thin man made of mere skin and bones standing on a scale, which displayed 60 pounds. Bonesy was smoking a cigarette and looked rather bored. On the other end of the spectrum was the supposedly fattest woman in the world. A large lady indeed, dressed in a pink dress, her too standing on a scale, this one displaying 500 pounds. Besides these 2 wonders of weight, there was to be found the 2-headed woman. A pair of conjoined twins touted as some sort of new binary mutant species. According to the sign next to the display, the two twins had polar opposite personalities. The left one was kind and shy, while the right was sassy and mean-spirited. Neither of them really looked their parts though, they just looked uncomfortable. Evelyn then began to feel ashamed and regretted coming into this hall of so-called freaks. She was just about to turn and leave when she spotted the fourth, what appeared to be the main attraction of the gallery. A big sign reading the horrific Piranha Boy. This attraction had gathered the largest crowd of people in the tent by far. Adults and children alike were pushing to see this Piranha Boy. Evelyn naturally got curious and a little frightened. What could be so horrific about him? And what in the world was a Piranha Boy? Images of all kinds of bizarre creatures entered her mind. She just simply had to see. So the little girl made her way to the crowd and squeezed herself through to the front. There, on a small stage, stood a man next to a large blanket. It seemed to be covering something up, like a cage, or perhaps a big fish tank. The man was dashing and dressed in a bright red tailcoat and wore a bright blue top hat. He resembled some kind of ringmaster. In a theatrical manner, the man was describing the macabre marvel of this so-called Piranha Boy. A strange creature some explorer had discovered in the rainforest of the Amazon, then brought to Europe where he had encountered it and bought it. Now he was here in this small town for these yokels to see. Well, he didn't exactly say that last part. Before pulling the blanket, the man warned the audience about the gruesome nature of this Piranha Boy. If there were any sensitive people present, they did best to leave now, he said in a serious tone. Of course, this only got the crowd even more excited. Very well, he said, and moved his hand towards the covered object, and with a swift movement, ripped the blanket away. The entire crowd gasped. Someone screamed. It was a fish tank underneath, a very big one, filled to the top with water. The hype certainly didn't disappoint, as what was in the tank was the most terrifying thing Evelyn had ever seen. A small boy submerged under the water, facing the audience, pressing himself against the glass. His skin was pale, and the sides of his neck were covered in gills. The worst part about the boy, though, was his face. That couldn't possibly have been a human face. It belonged to a piranha, yet was somehow attached to the form of a human. The eyes, beady and small, were set too far apart from each other. The nose was almost non-existent, being only two small holes, and the mouth was elongated far beyond that of any normal human being. Uneven and asymmetrical, it looked more like someone had carved it into his face, one long scar. It was filled with rows of jagged teeth in all kinds of sizes and shapes, some of which were sharp like blades. His visage was incredibly hard to look at. The boy, if you could call it that, stared at the audience with his small beady eyes, grinning with his grotesque mouth. Evelyn felt faint and immediately wanted to leave, but the crowd was pushing too hard to let her get through. Meanwhile, the man in the top hat went on to describe the bizarre nature of this specimen, explaining it couldn't live outside of water. It also ate raw meat. The man produced a bag and pulled out a large piece of meat, either from a pig or a cow. Observe the piranha boy's eating habits, and how quickly it consumes its prey, he said, adding, remember, this easily could have been a living animal. He then dropped the meat into the tank. The piranha boy jumped at it and caught it with its mouth, viciously chewing it to bits in a matter of seconds. The water became red with blood, making it difficult to see what was going on, which was probably for the best. The man winked at the audience and said, I wouldn't stick my finger in there if I were you. Some chuckled, while most just stood there, speechless, jaws dropping to the floor. Okay, that's it for today, good folks. Let's leave our piranha boy to his dinner. The dashing man exclaimed and threw the blanket back over the tank. The crowd, still in shock, slowly dragged themselves out of the tent, mumbling amongst each other of the horror they'd been made witness to. Evelyn could finally leave, and rushed out of the place, leaving the carnival in a hurry. Hours later, while she was in her room with her books, she still couldn't get the image of the piranha boy out of her mind. That face and those teeth ripping the raw meat apart was burned into her retinas. Even when she closed her eyes, the image was still there. That night she had a hard time sleeping. And as a result was 2 hours late for school the following day. Not that anyone cared. Besides her scolding teacher, of course. The image of the piranha boy continued to haunt her for days, and eventually she even began having nightmares about him. That horrific sight just wouldn't leave her alone. Finally, Evelyn decided she had had enough. It had to end. But how? The only idea she could think of was to go back to the carnival and witness the piranha boy once again, confront her fears. Maybe it had been that initial shock of it, and perhaps it wasn't so horrifying after all. Well, there was only one way to find out. Consumed with this idea, Evelyn skipped school entirely the next day and went straight to the carnival. To her disappointment, she found that the freak show hadn't opened for the day yet. She was simply too early. The man in the top hat was nearby, tending to a booth. Considered approaching him and asking when the freak show would open, but refrained from doing so. Talking to strangers wasn't really her forte. Instead, Evelyn began to wander the place, thinking of going home again soon. Maybe she could come back later. However, somehow, while wandering, the small girl managed to slip through to the very back of the carnival unseen. She hadn't really done it on purpose. Lost in her thoughts, she just sorta ended up, and that's how she found it. A large cage covered in drapes. Somehow she just knew the piranha boy was in there. Where else would they keep him? It made sense. So she approached the mysterious cage and carefully grabbed one of the drapes. Her hand was trembling and she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. It felt like her chest was going to explode. She'd never been this scared in her life. Maybe it was a bad idea after all. Maybe she should just turn and leave. Forget the whole thing. But no, she couldn't. She had to go through with it. So Evelyn slowly lifted the drape and peeked into whatever was behind it. It was a cage, just as she had figured. A steel cage with bars. Somewhere in there, in the darkness, something was stirring. Evelyn couldn't hear any sounds of water though, which she had expected. The thing needed water to survive, right? Pulling the drape away further to let in some more light, Evelyn saw something. It was a pale little boy, lying down on the floor of the cage. The piranha boy. He looked up and stared right at her with those freaky eyes. She wanted to run away, but couldn't move. She was paralyzed with dread. The piranha boy's grotesque face had an expression of surprise on it. Surprise which would soon turn into rage or maniacal glee, Evelyn thought. But it didn't. Instead, the boy's surprise turned into outright fear, and he quickly huddled away to the back of the cage, pressing himself against the bars. He stared at her with near panic in his inhuman eyes, not so inhuman any longer. Evelyn was perplexed. Her fear began to subside, and it was now she who was surprised. The boy whimpered like a frightened dog, but didn't say anything. if he even could speak. Evelyn didn't know how to react to this. She had come here hoping the terrible piranha boy wasn't as horrifying as she thought, but this was certainly not what she had expected. The boy wasn't scary. He wasn't scary at all. He was just a sad, strange little thing, terrified out of his own mind. Evelyn said hello to the boy and explained she didn't mean any harm. He didn't respond and stayed at the back of the cage, yet something in his eyes changed, if ever so slightly. The fear was replaced with something that more resembled confusement. She asked him if he could understand her, but before she could stick around and wait for a potential reply, footsteps were heard. Footsteps coming their way. Evelyn panicked and quickly placed the drape back into place, then ran behind some crates nearby. It was the man in a top hat. He inspected the piranha boy's cage, and while he was busy doing that, Evelyn sneaked past behind him and left the carnival. Despite this new encounter, Evelyn was still haunted by the piranha boy and found herself unable to sleep that night. Her obsession had completely transformed, however. Before it was rooted in fear, now it was feelings of sympathy towards the boy that kept her awake. What was going on with that poor creature? Was he even inhuman at all? Clearly things weren't as they seemed. The next day she told her parents about the whole thing, but they barely paid any attention and seemed more upset at her wasting money on a carnival. After that, Evelyn counted her parents out of the entire affair. She skipped school once again that day and returned to the carnival. This time she had brought a book, one of her favorites, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, filled with wondrous and colorful illustrations. She was going to show it to the piranha boy, proving that she came in peace. Like last time, she easily sneaked her way to the back of the carnival where the boy's cage was located. Feeling no fear this time, she confidently yet gently lifted one of the drapes of the cage. The boy was startled and quickly huddled to the back, but he didn't look quite as terrified as last time. Evelyn said hello and repeated that she meant no harm. She then introduced herself as Evelyn, a girl of 9 years of age who lived with her mom and dad in a small house in town. She asked him what his name was, because that obviously wasn't the horrific piranha boy. The boy began to move his grotesque mouth and stutter, like he was trying to say something. Evelyn was patient and gave him the time he needed, and then it finally came out. Jim. His voice and pronunciation was awkward. It was clearly difficult to speak with a mouth like that. Evelyn greeted him again, calling him by his name. She then sat down by the bars and held up The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, showcasing its colorful cover. Jim was immediately intrigued by it. Dorothy in her blue dress and ruby slippers, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow. This is one of my favorite stories, she explained. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I wanted to share it with you. She began to read the book out loud for Jim, all the while showing him the illustrations. She didn't really need to look at the text herself, as she knew the story by heart, more or less. As Evelyn related the adventure of Dorothy, Jim began to slowly move away from the back of his cage and closer to her. His eyes darted from the pages of the book up to Evelyn's face. After she read about a quarter of the book, she decided to stop. By then, Jim was only a couple of feet away from her. Afraid that someone might catch her, she told the boy she had to go, but that she would be back tomorrow and continue the story. Jim still had a perplexed look on his face as she covered the cage with the drape and whispered goodbye. Then she was off. Just as she had promised, Evelyn returned the next day. This time she stopped at a cotton candy stand before going to see Jim. She bought one cone, as she couldn't afford two, and brought it to the cage. As she pulled away the drapes, she found Jim sitting in the middle of the cage. He didn't seem scared this time, and stayed where he was, not rushing off to the back. He was still a bit cautious to approach her though, but that changed quickly as she sat down and offered some cotton candy. Evelyn pulled off a large tuft of blue candy from the cone and reached it in between the bars of the cage. Jim looked at it for a few seconds, then grabbed it carefully. A mere moment later, it was gone. Seeing the boy shyly eat colorful cotton candy was nothing like witnessing his performance, where he viciously tore a raw piece of meat to bits. Evelyn had some candy too, but eventually she figured Jim could have the whole thing. He probably needed it more than she did. While he ate at the fluffy blue stuff, she continued to read the story of Dorothy and her wacky pals. This time they got halfway through until she decided to leave. She took the empty candy cone with her to rid of any evidence. Evelyn was back the next day. This time she found Jim peering out of his cage from between the drapes. Apparently he had been expecting her. It continued like this for a couple of weeks. They plowed through several Oz books. Evelyn had to borrow the rest of them from the library, as the only one she actually owned was the first one. She got Jim to talk more, and they began discussing the various characters in the books. Jim said that Evelyn was Dorothy while he was the Cowardly Lion. She wondered why the lion, and he felt it was pretty obvious, as they were both animals with fangs. After that, Evelyn began probing about just what Jim's exact nature was. What was he? The poor boy didn't really know himself. He said he'd had this face as long as he could remember. He never had a dad, and his mother sold him to Mr. Hughes when he was very young. Mr. Hughes was apparently the man in the top hat, the manager of the carnival. Mr. Hughes had used his surgical tool to carve the gills into Jim's neck, to make him look more the part, as he had put it. He then taught Jim how to hold his breath for a very long time, and also how to rip apart a piece of raw meat in a matter of seconds. Mr. Hughes kept Jim in his cage because he was afraid he'd begin to wander otherwise, and then people might see him and get scared and attack him, or so Mr. Hughes had said. Evelyn was shocked at hearing all of this. Sure, she was just 9 years old, but she could still get the gist of what was going on here. Something had to be done. That day she went home with a lot on her mind. She had to but then remembered how they reacted last time. They wouldn't be of any help. They'd probably just give her a curfew. Could she go to the police? They would probably help, but would they believe her? And if she came marching to the carnival with the police in tow, wouldn't Mr. Hughes pull some kind of trick? Maybe he'd hide Jim away. Maybe she'd just make things worse for him. Before leaving that night, she pickpocketed $100 from her dad's wallet. Startup money for her and Jim's new life. At the stroke of midnight, she left her family home for the last time. He rubbed him to make sure he was seeing right. Evelyn coming to visit in the middle of the night. He couldn't quite believe it, but it was true. His grotesque mouth turned into a big smile, and he almost called out her name. She quickly shushed him, however, whispering that they had to keep quiet. She then explained that he was getting out of that cage. The two of them were running away, together. She was there to set him free. He got a worried look in his eyes. Evelyn could tell Jim was feeling conflicted. She ripped the cage's door open and stepped inside, grabbed Jim's arm and dragged him out. His steps were uncertain and awkward, but he came along. From the bag, Evelyn pulled out a blanket. She threw it over the boy's shoulders. The plan was to cover him up when it became necessary, like in places too public where people might react strongly to Jim's appearance, or if people from the carnival came after them. As the pair turned around, ready to leave, they were met by Mr. Hughes. He was standing there, right in front of them, bottle still in his hand. His eyes were glassy and bloodshot, and his shoulders slouched. He looked to be having trouble standing. The man started to slur with an aggressive tone, demanding to know what was going on. As he took a few clumsy steps towards them, Evelyn saw it. Jim did too, and he never had before. Mr. Hughes' shirt was unbuttoned all the way down to his belly, revealing his chest, and on that chest was a strange growth. A growth with the outlines of a face, a parasitic twin brother. Mr. Hughes noticed that they were staring at his chest, so he quickly took a few steps back and began to cover himself up. While he was distracted, Evelyn lifted the bolt cutter high up in the air with both hands and swung it at the man. She struck his leg, causing him to cry out in pain. She then discarded the tool, grabbed Jim's hand, and the two went running. Evelyn was panicking. This was not how it was supposed to go. She began to plead to Hughes and the group to just let them go. Jim shouldn't be locked up the way he was. It was inhuman, she said. He shouldn't be forced into doing all of those horrible things as part of his act. Mr. Hughes responded with a gunshot. They echoed throughout the entire neighborhood. Body still. Blood began to trickle down a manhole. Who knows why he did it? Maybe because she was trying to steal his star attraction. Maybe because she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Or perhaps he was simply too drunk and had no idea what he had just done. The probable answer was most likely all of the above. Jim's frightened face transformed into a monstrous expression of rage. His hideous mouth snarled and he exposed rows of razor-sharp teeth. Before Mr. Hughes could even react, the horrific piranha boy was upon him, tearing out his throat with his teeth. Blood splattered all over the alley, and the carnies stood petrified and watched in terror. In a matter of seconds, there wasn't a whole lot of throat left. Hughes had taught him well. His entire face covered in blood, the piranha boy rose from the corpse of his former master and turned to his audience. They all shrieked and ran away. No one really knows how long the piranha boy stayed in that alley with his beloved friend Evelyn. But a couple of days later, the police tracked him down to the sewers. They found him there hiding out, behaving like a rabid animal. Their attempt to apprehend him cost the lives of 2 officers, and several others were injured. In the end though, with a heavy usage of stun guns and batons, they were able to subdue him. Jim the Piranha Boy spent the next decade in a special home for troubled children with violent tendencies. It was no better than a carnival, as the other kids bullied him mercilessly. Constantly sedated, there wasn't much he could do about it either. Finally, at the age of 18, he was sent here. It's now up to me to cure patient 502 and drive the savagery out of him. I think I've found the solution too. All he needs is someone to treat him like a human being, show him some empathy, some tenderness and compassion. Or I can just fry his brain with electrodes again. Maybe I'll flip a coin.